Anime has always been a part of my life. Growing up, I spent countless afternoons glued to the screen, completely immersed in the worlds of vibrant characters, thrilling adventures, and breathtaking artistry. It's more than just entertainment to me. It's a form of escape, a passion, a piece of who I am. When I met my boyfriend, one of the first things we connected over was our mutual love for anime. It felt almost serendipitous, finding someone who not only appreciated the medium, but shared the same enthusiasm for exploring different series. From action-packed shonen battles to heartfelt slice-of-life stories, we devoured them together. Our anime nights quickly became a cherished ritual: snacks on the coffee table, dimmed lights, and the perfect mix of laughter and discussion about the shows. In those early days, I didn't think much about his comments during our watch sessions. He would throw in casual remarks about how cute a certain character was or how cool someone looked. I even laughed along with him sometimes. It felt harmless, just part of his playful personality. To me, it was just one of those quirks that made watching anime together feel special. Looking back, though, I realized there was something about his comments that stood out more than I initially thought. They weren't just offhand remarks. They were consistent, detailed, and always seemed to gravitate toward specific aspects of the characters. At first, it didn't bother me. After all, we were both fans, and it was natural to notice the artistry and character designs. Still, a small voice in the back of my mind wondered, was this just part of the experience for him? Or was there something deeper to it? I shrugged it off, focusing on the joy of sharing something we both loved. For a while, that was enough. As our anime nights continued, I began to notice a pattern in his remarks. Almost every time a female character appeared on screen, especially one with a striking design, he'd have something to say. It was rarely subtle, and it usually leaned toward the exaggerated or over the top. Comments like, "God damn, look at those thighs," or "those titties are unreal," would punctuate nearly every episode we watched. At first, I thought he was just being funny, maybe mimicking the way some fans talk about characters online. But over time, the frequency of these comments started to stand out to me. It wasn't just an occasional observation about a character's design. It was consistent, and it almost felt like he was waiting for the next moment to make another remark. If the character was wearing something revealing or designed to accentuate certain features, it was practically guaranteed that he'd have a comment ready. What really caught my attention, though, was the way he talked about male characters in comparison. His comments about them were far fewer and much more restrained. He might casually say, "That guy's got style," or "He's a good-looking dude," but it lacked the same level of enthusiasm or detail. Sometimes he'd even ask me, "Do you think he's hot?" in a way that felt a bit like he was trying to catch me off guard. At first, I brushed it off as just his personality. He's the type who enjoys a bit of banter and doesn't hold back when he's comfortable. But as the comments became more frequent, I started to feel something. It wasn't jealousy exactly, but there was a growing sense of unease I couldn't quite shake. I didn't want to overthink it, so I kept quiet, hoping it was just a phase or something I could learn to ignore. The contrast between how he commented on female characters versus male characters became increasingly clear to me. While he'd make detailed, almost hyperbolic remarks about the women, their bodies, their outfits, even how they moved, his comments about male characters were, at best, surface level. A typical observation might be something like, "That guy looks sharp," or "He's got a cool vibe." They were so casual, almost dismissive compared to the vivid language he reserved for the female characters. What stood out even more was how he often turned the conversation toward me whenever a male character was involved. He'd ask, "Do you think he's hot?" Or, "That's your type, isn't it?" It always felt like a trap, as if he was baiting me into admitting something. I never knew how to respond. Was I supposed to agree? Disagree? Joke back? No matter what I said, it felt awkward, like there was some unspoken game going on that I didn't sign up for. The imbalance in how he talked about characters began to weigh on me. It wasn't just the content of his comments, it was the energy behind them. When a female character came on screen, his tone was excited, animated, almost gleeful. But with male characters, it was restrained, almost indifferent, unless he was directing the focus back to me. It made me wonder, was this just how he engaged with anime? Was he more drawn to certain characters? Or was there something else going on? I didn't know how to ask without sounding accusatory or overly sensitive. Instead, I kept my thoughts to myself, trying to figure out if it was something I could ignore. After all, they were just fictional characters, right? Yet, the growing disparity in his tone started to gnaw at me. Something didn't feel right. At first, I tried to brush off my feelings. I told myself it was all harmless fun, just his way of engaging with the shows we watched. But the more we settled in for our anime nights, the more I found myself anticipating his comments, dreading them almost. Every time a new female character appeared on screen, I'd tense up, waiting for the inevitable remark. It wasn't jealousy, I was sure of that. I didn't feel threatened by these fictional women, no matter how idealized they were. But there was something about the frequency and intensity of his comments that made me feel off. It was as if they overshadowed everything else. Instead of immersing ourselves in the story or connecting over the plot, the focus always seemed to shift to the characters' appearances. There was one evening, in particular, that stands out. We were watching a popular shonen anime, and a new female character made her debut. She was undeniably designed to be eye-catching. Large eyes, exaggerated curves, and a revealing outfit. Before I could even process her introduction, he blurted out, "Holy hell, they went all out with her, huh? Look at that outfit, those legs." I tried to laugh it off, but inside, I felt a flicker of frustration. Couldn't we just watch without the running commentary? It was like I already knew what he'd say before he said it, and that predictability made it worse. I started to wonder if he even realized how often he did it, or if he thought it was normal. Still, I didn't say anything that night. I didn't want to ruin the mood or seem like I was nitpicking. Instead, I pushed the feeling down, trying to focus on the episode. But the discomfort lingered, growing a little stronger each time. Eventually, the discomfort became too much to ignore. I knew I needed to bring it up, but I wasn't sure how. I didn't want to make it a big deal or turn it into an argument, so I waited for the right moment. One evening, after we'd finished an episode and were still sitting on the couch, I decided to speak up. "Hey," I started, trying to keep my tone casual. "Can I ask you something about the way you comment on the characters when we're watching anime?" He glanced at me, clearly curious, but not alarmed. "Sure, what's up?" I took a deep breath and explained how I'd been feeling. I told him it wasn't about jealousy or feeling insecure, but more about how repetitive the comments had become. "It's just that. It happens a lot," I said, choosing my words carefully. "And sometimes it feels like it overshadows everything else, like the story or the moments we're supposed to be enjoying together." He seemed surprised, almost confused. "They're fictional characters," he said with a shrug. "It's not like it means anything. I just say what comes to mind." "I get that," I replied, trying to stay calm. "But imagine if it were the other way around. If I made those kinds of comments about male characters all the time, wouldn't that feel a little weird to you?" He paused for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't think so. And besides, most shows don't have as many hot guys as they do hot girls. It's just how anime is." I didn't want to push too hard, so I left it at that for the night. But his response stuck with me. The way he brushed it off made me feel like he wasn't really hearing me, and that hurt more than I expected. After our first conversation, I tried to let it go. I told myself he had a point. They were just fictional characters after all. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like that explanation didn't address the real issue. It wasn't about the characters themselves or whether they were real or not. It was about how his comments made me feel. The next time the topic came up, it wasn't planned. We were watching another anime, and as expected, a female character made her entrance. She had the usual over-the-top design, tiny waist, long legs, and an outfit that left little to the imagination. Right on cue, he let out an exaggerated, "Damn, they really knew what they were doing with her, huh?" I sighed, unable to stop myself this time. "You do realize you say stuff like that every time, right?" He looked at me, clearly caught off guard. "What? It's just a joke. They're not real people." I know they're not real, I said, trying to keep my tone even, but that's not the point. It's not about them being fictional. It's about how it feels to hear those comments constantly. He frowned, still not understanding. Why would it bother you? It's not like I'm comparing them to you or anything. They're just characters. I didn't know how to explain it in a way that would make sense to him. It wasn't jealousy, and it wasn't insecurity, but it was something. I just wish you'd tone it down a little, I said finally. It's hard to enjoy watching when I know what's coming every time. He shrugged. It's really not that serious. You're overthinking it. His dismissal stung, and I realized then that this wasn't going to be an easy conversation to resolve. After that conversation, I started paying even more attention to how often the comments came up. It wasn't just every now and then. It was constant. Almost every episode, without fail, there'd be something. A remark about a character's proportions, a joke about their outfit, or an exaggerated reaction to their design. It became so predictable that I could practically script it myself. And the thing is, once you notice something like that, it's impossible to unsee. Instead of enjoying the story or the characters for who they were, I found myself waiting for his next comment, bracing for it. I could feel the tension building inside me every time a new female character appeared on screen, knowing it was only a matter of seconds before he'd say something. It wasn't like he was trying to ruin the experience for me. I knew that. He probably didn't even realize how much it was affecting me. But for me, the repetition was starting to weigh heavily on our shared hobby. What used to feel like a bonding experience, something we both loved and looked forward to, now felt like a source of quiet frustration. One night, it all came to a head. We were watching a particularly fan service-heavy series, and it felt like every few minutes there was another exaggerated comment. Seriously, who designs these outfits? He laughed at one point. They're barely even clothes. I forced a laugh, trying to play along, but inside, I was seething. It wasn't the specific comment that got to me. It was the inevitability of it. The way it kept pulling me out of the story and reminding me of this growing divide between us. It wasn't just about anime anymore. It was about how something so small and seemingly insignificant could start to feel so big. I needed to figure out what to do about it. After yet another anime night filled with the usual commentary, I decided to try a different approach. Maybe if I flipped the situation around, he'd understand how I was feeling. One evening, during a quiet moment, I asked him, "How would you feel if the roles were reversed? If I made those kinds of comments about male characters all the time?" He gave me a dismissive shrug. "I don't think I'd care. It's not like they're real people." I wasn't convinced. But what if it was constant? Like, every time a guy showed up, I pointed out his abs or his jawline or how attractive he was. He paused for a moment, then laughed. "Well, I guess I'd just be surprised you were into that many guys in anime." His response frustrated me. It felt like he wasn't taking the question seriously. "It's not about being into anyone," I said, trying to clarify. "It's about how that kind of focus might make you feel after a while. Wouldn't it get annoying?" "I don't know," he said, brushing it off. "I guess it'd be different if there were more hot guys in anime, but there just aren't as many. It's mostly about the girls, you know?" That comment hit a nerve. I couldn't help but feel like he was completely missing the point. It wasn't about the ratio of attractive characters. It was about how often his comments disrupted the flow of our watching experience, and how they made me feel, whether he intended it or not. I realized then that getting him to understand my perspective wouldn't be as simple as flipping the script. He didn't see his behavior as an issue, so he couldn't imagine how it might affect me. Still, I wasn't ready to give up on finding a way to make him understand. After that conversation, I started questioning myself more than ever. Was I being unreasonable? Was I overreacting to something that really didn't matter? I'd always considered myself a confident person, but his comments were beginning to chip away at that confidence in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't that I felt jealous of the fictional characters. How could I? They weren't real, and I knew that. But there was a part of me that couldn't help but compare myself to them, even though I didn't want to. The idealized proportions, the flawless features, the way they were designed to capture attention, it all felt so far removed from reality. And yet, Hearing him repeatedly gush over them made me wonder if, on some level, he wished I was more like that. I hated feeling this way. I knew it was irrational, but the repetition of his remarks made it hard to shake. It wasn't just about the characters anymore. It was about what his focus on them said about what he noticed and valued. Did he see me in the same light? Or was I simply the person he shared his anime nights with, while the fantasy characters were where his real excitement lay? I tried to remind myself of the things he loved about me, our shared sense of humor, the way we clicked so naturally, the moments when he made me feel truly special. But in the back of my mind, those doubts lingered, feeding into a growing insecurity I couldn't quite name. I didn't know how to express this to him without sounding petty or overly sensitive. Every time I thought about bringing it up, I stopped myself, afraid of how he might react or whether he'd even take me seriously. So, I kept it to myself, letting it fester silently. I convinced myself that I was making too much out of nothing. Maybe I was overanalyzing his comments, reading too much into them when, in reality, they were just harmless observations. He's just being himself, I told myself repeatedly. It doesn't mean anything. I decided to focus on the fact that he wasn't intentionally trying to hurt me. He wasn't comparing me to these characters, and he never made any comments about me in relation to them. To him, they were purely fictional, an artistic exaggeration, nothing more. I kept telling myself that this was just his way of enjoying anime, and that it had nothing to do with me personally. So I tried to ignore it. When he made his usual remarks, I'd laugh half-heartedly or simply let them pass without reacting. I thought that if I didn't give his comments any attention, they'd start to bother me less. Maybe I could train myself to tune them out, to separate my feelings from what he was saying. But the more I tried to push the discomfort aside, the harder it became. It felt like I was forcing myself to endure something that wasn't fair or necessary. Every time I suppressed how I felt, I could feel the frustration building, like a balloon slowly inflating, ready to burst. There were moments when I thought about speaking up again, but I hesitated. I didn't want to seem like I was nagging or creating problems where there didn't need to be any. So, I kept swallowing my feelings, hoping they'd eventually go away. But deep down, I knew that pretending it didn't bother me wasn't a solution. It was just delaying the inevitable, a conversation I wasn't sure how to approach without everything unraveling. As time went on, I started noticing something unsettling. The comments, once something that had caught my attention because they stood out, now felt like just another part of our anime nights. They were so frequent and predictable that they almost became background noise. I wasn't sure if that was better or worse. On the one hand, it seemed like I'd grown used to them. I didn't flinch anymore when he'd comment on a character's outfit or body. It was just part of the rhythm of watching anime together. But on the other hand, the fact that I'd normalized something that bothered me so much felt wrong. I wasn't really okay with it. I'd just learned to endure it. The worst part was that he seemed completely unaware of how much it was affecting me. To him, nothing had changed. If anything, he seemed more comfortable, more uninhibited with his remarks, as if my silence had given him a green light. Meanwhile, I felt like I was trapped in a loop, stuck between wanting to keep the peace and feeling increasingly disconnected from something I used to love. There were moments when I tried to test the waters, bringing up the topic indirectly. I'd make a casual comment about how fan service heavy a particular anime was, hoping he'd catch on. But his response was always the same: a shrug, a laugh, or another remark about how that's just how anime is. I started to wonder if this was just something I had to accept. Maybe I was being too sensitive, and this was normal for other couples who watched anime together. But every time I tried to convince myself of that, it felt like I was dismissing my own feelings. I didn't know how to reconcile those two sides of myself, the part that wanted to let it go and the part that couldn't. One night, we decided to start a new series, a popular shonen anime that I had been excited to watch for months. The reviews were glowing, and I was eager to dive into the story and meet its cast of characters. For the first couple of episodes, everything was great. The pacing was strong, the action sequences were incredible, and the characters seemed promising. But then, as if on cue, a fan service-heavy character was introduced. She had all the classic tropes: a revealing outfit, impossibly exaggerated proportions, and a flirtatious personality that felt shoehorned into an otherwise intense scene. Before I could even take in her role in the plot, he chimed in with a loud laugh. "Oh, come on, look at her. They're not even trying to be subtle." I tried to ignore it, focusing on the dialogue, but it didn't stop there. As the episode went on, every time she appeared on screen, he had something to add. "How is that even functional armor?" he joked at one point. And later, "I swear, this designer has one thing on their mind." What made it worse was that I could feel my excitement for the anime draining away. This was supposed to be a story I could lose myself in, something I'd been looking forward to for ages. But now, all I could think about was how her presence had turned the experience into another round of commentary that I didn't ask for. I didn't want to laugh along. I didn't want to add to the jokes. I just wanted to enjoy the show. By the end of the episode, I felt deflated. When he turned to me, grinning, and asked, "What did you think?" I didn't know how to answer. All I could think was how tired I felt, of the comments, of pretending they didn't bother me, and of how they were starting to overshadow something I loved. That night, I decided I couldn't keep avoiding the conversation. I waited until we'd cleaned up the snacks and turned off the TV, then sat down next to him on the couch. My heart was racing, but I knew I had to bring it up again, this time, more directly. "Hey," I started softly, "can we talk about something that's been on my mind?" He looked over at me, curious but not concerned. "Sure. What's up?" I took a deep breath. "It's about the way you comment on the characters when we watch anime. I've tried to let it go, but honestly, it's starting to really bother me." His expression shifted slightly, his brow furrowing. "Bother you? Why?" "They're just jokes." "I know," I said quickly, trying to keep my tone calm. "And I'm not saying you mean anything by them, but it's constant, and it makes it hard for me to enjoy the shows. I feel like instead of focusing on the story, I'm bracing myself for the next comment." He sighed and leaned back, crossing his arms. "I don't get it. They're not real people. Why would it bother you?" I paused, choosing my words carefully. "It's not about them being real or not. It's about how it feels for me. It's like, it takes away from the experience, you know? And I can't help but wonder if you'd feel the same way if I did it as often as you do." He shrugged, brushing it off again. "I wouldn't care. I think you're overthinking this." The dismissal stung, but I didn't push further. I'd said my piece, and that was all I could do for now. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't being heard, and that hurt more than the comments ever did. After our conversation, I couldn't stop replaying his words in my mind. "You're overthinking this." Was I? I started questioning myself more deeply than ever, trying to dissect my emotions and figure out why his comments were bothering me so much. I didn't feel jealous, and I wasn't insecure about my looks. So why couldn't I just laugh along or let it go like he seemed to expect? The more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't just the comments themselves, it was what they represented. They weren't just remarks about fictional characters. They were a reminder of how differently we approached this shared hobby. For me, watching anime was about immersing myself in the story, the world, and the characters' journeys. For him, it felt like it was more about entertainment, humor, and aesthetics. Neither approach was wrong, but the disconnect between them was growing harder to ignore. What really got to me, though, was the way he dismissed my feelings. It wasn't just that he didn't understand. He didn't seem to think it was worth understanding. His insistence that it wasn't a big deal made me feel small, like my perspective didn't matter. I started to wonder if I was making things worse by keeping it all bottled up. Maybe if I had been more honest earlier on, we wouldn't have reached this point. But even as I reflected, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that maybe he was right. Maybe I was overthinking it. I hated feeling stuck in this cycle of doubt, second-guessing myself every time I tried to address the issue. I wanted to believe that my feelings were valid, but his casual dismissal had planted a seed of uncertainty that was hard to ignore. For now, I decided to give it more time, both for him to process what I'd said and for me to figure out my next step. In the days that followed, I started wondering how other couples handled situations like this. Did everyone face little quirks or habits in their partner that annoyed them? Or was this something unique to us? I needed perspective, so I turned to a couple of close friends, hoping for some clarity. During a casual conversation, I brought it up without getting too specific. Do you guys ever get annoyed by something small your partner does, but you don't know if it's worth addressing? I asked, keeping my tone light. One of my friends laughed. Oh, all the time. My boyfriend chews so loudly, it drives me insane. But what am I going to do? Start a fight over it? Another friend chimed in. Yeah, but sometimes the little things can add up, you know? Like, if it's something that keeps happening, you have to say something eventually. I nodded, feeling a little better. At least I wasn't alone in struggling with minor frustrations. But as we talked more, I started to realize that my issue wasn't just about being annoyed. It wasn't like the sound of chewing or leaving the toilet seat up. It was something deeper, something that felt tied to how we communicated and respected each other's feelings. I hesitated to share the full context with them. How could I explain that my issue wasn't just with his comments, but with how he dismissed my attempts to talk about it? I worried they'd tell me I was being dramatic, just like he had. So I kept the details vague, listening instead of opening up fully. Still, the conversation made one thing clear. I couldn't keep ignoring this. It wasn't about the comments anymore. It was about whether he cared enough to try to understand where I was coming from. That realization made me even more determined to find a way forward, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. After reflecting on my friend's advice, I decided to approach the situation differently. Maybe I didn't need to stop his comments entirely. Perhaps I could learn to tune them out, or focus on the parts of our anime nights that I still enjoyed. I wanted to preserve the time we spent together, even if his remarks occasionally grated on me. The next time we sat down to watch, I made a conscious effort to shift my mindset. I told myself, just enjoy the show, don't focus on what he says. For the first few minutes, it worked. I got lost in the vibrant animation, the intricate storyline, and the characters' interactions. But then, as expected, a female character appeared. Beautiful, bold, and clad in an outfit that screamed fan service. Wow, they're really not holding back, he said with a laugh. How does she even walk in that? I took a deep breath, willing myself to stay calm. Instead of reacting, I kept my eyes on the screen, trying to absorb the scene. But the comment lingered in the air, pulling me out of the moment. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, my frustration bubbled up again. It wasn't just the words. It was the predictability of it. The way it made me feel like we were watching two entirely different shows. Later that night, I replayed the episode in my head, realizing how much I'd missed because I was so focused on holding back my irritation. My attempt to let it go hadn't worked. Instead, it felt like I was forcing myself to tolerate something that was genuinely bothering me. I couldn't help but wonder, was compromise even possible if he didn't see a problem with his behavior? And if not, what did that mean for us and the time we spent together? I realized that if we were going to find a way forward, I needed to try harder to understand his perspective. It wasn't that I hadn't been listening, but maybe I hadn't fully considered how he saw the situation. He clearly didn't think his comments were a big deal, and I wondered if I'd been too focused on my own feelings to see where he was coming from. One evening, while we were having dinner, I brought it up again, this time from a different angle. Can I ask you something? I began cautiously. Sure, he said, glancing up from his plate. When you make those comments during anime, what's going through your mind? Like, is it just a joke, or is it something you feel the need to say out loud? He thought for a moment, then shrugged. I don't know. It's just part of how I watch, I guess. It's not like I'm thinking about it that much. I just say what comes to mind. That made sense, in a way. He wasn't putting deep thought into his remarks. They were off-the-cuff observations, not deliberate attempts to irritate me. Okay, but do you ever feel like it might distract from the story, or that it might make it harder for me to focus on what's happening? He raised an eyebrow. I never thought about it that way. I guess I just assumed it didn't bother you because you never really said anything until recently. His response hit me. Maybe I hadn't been clear enough before, or maybe he just hadn't realized how much it affected me. Either way, it was clear we were coming at this from completely different places, And if we were going to meet in the middle, we'd both need to put in the effort to bridge that gap. After our conversation, I spent a lot of time thinking about the line between fiction and reality. For him, the characters he commented on were nothing more than drawings. Exaggerated and idealized, sure, but ultimately unreal. To him, they were simply part of the entertainment. But for me, his comments felt more personal than that. They might have been directed at fictional characters, but they had a real impact on how I experienced our time together. I wondered if I was making the mistake of projecting too much meaning onto his words. Was I blurring the line between his appreciation for character designs and how he felt about me? Or was it fair to want him to be more mindful, even if it wasn't intentional on his part? The next time we watched an episode, I decided to observe how I felt in the moment instead of preemptively bracing myself. When a particularly fan-servicey character showed up, he predictably made a comment about her proportions, laughing as he added, "They really went all out with her, didn't they?" I noticed my gut reaction, an immediate tightening in my chest, a small flicker of frustration. But I also realized that part of my reaction was tied to how I interpreted his words. He wasn't saying, "This is what I want in real life." He was just pointing out something exaggerated and ridiculous about the character. It didn't make the frustration disappear, but it gave me a bit more clarity. Still, I couldn't help but wonder if he'd feel the same way if the tables were turned. Would he be as indifferent if I made constant remarks about the attractiveness of male characters? The question lingered in my mind, but I decided to save it for another time. For now, I was still sorting through my own feelings. As much as I tried to rationalize everything, the truth was becoming clearer. His comments were affecting our time together. What used to feel like a fun, shared escape had turned into something that I increasingly dreaded. Instead of looking forward to our anime nights, I found myself bracing for them, unsure of whether I'd be able to enjoy the story without his running commentary pulling me out of the moment. It wasn't just about the anime anymore. It was about the way his remarks changed the energy between us. I started noticing the small things. How I felt less excited to suggest new shows. How I hesitated before agreeing to watch something with him. How much quieter I'd become during our sessions. Even when I tried to focus on the positive moments, the looming expectation of his next comment always lingered in the back of my mind. One night, as we wrapped up another episode, he turned to me and said, "You've been really quiet lately. Everything okay?" I paused, unsure how to answer. Part of me wanted to brush it off, to say, "I'm fine," and avoid another awkward conversation. But the other part of me knew that pretending wasn't helping. "I guess I've just been distracted," I said carefully, not wanting to sound accusatory. "Distracted by what?" he asked, genuinely curious. I hesitated before replying. "I think it's just hard for me to fully enjoy the shows sometimes. I don't know if it's the comments or what, but it feels like I'm not as into it as I used to be." He frowned, clearly puzzled. "I don't get it. You love anime. Why would something so small bother you that much?" I didn't have a simple answer. All I knew was that what used to bring us closer was now creating a subtle, growing divide, and I wasn't sure how to fix it. After our last conversation, I realized something had to change. I didn't want anime nights to turn into a source of tension between us, but I also couldn't keep ignoring how I felt. I started thinking about compromises, ways we could keep watching together without his comments taking away from my enjoyment. One evening, I decided to bring it up again, but this time with a different approach. "Hey," I started, trying to sound casual. "What if we tried something a little different when we watch anime?" He raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "I was thinking," I said slowly. "Maybe we could tone down the commentary a bit. Not stop completely. I know you like making jokes, but maybe keep it to the really funny moments or things that actually add to the show." He looked at me, seeming a little skeptical. "But that's part of the fun for me, you know? Just saying whatever pops into my head." "I get that," I replied, trying to meet him halfway. "But sometimes it feels like it's all we focus on. I just want to enjoy the story and the characters without always thinking about how they look." He leaned back, considering it. "So, you want me to just not say anything about the characters at all?" "Not at all," I said quickly. Just maybe less often. Or focus on other things, like the plot or the action scenes. I think it would make it more enjoyable for both of us. He nodded slowly, though I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. I mean, I guess I could try, but it's just how I watch stuff. It's not like I'm doing it on purpose to annoy you. That was all I could ask for, a willingness to try. It felt like a small step, but at least it was a step in the right direction. After our conversation, I felt cautiously optimistic. He'd agreed to try, which was more than I had expected, but a part of me still worried about whether he truly understood why this mattered to me. It wasn't just about the comments themselves, it was about what they represented. To me, they reflected a deeper issue, whether he respected my feelings enough to take them seriously. I started paying close attention during our next anime session. For the first few episodes, he kept his promise. He still made comments, but they were fewer, less intense, and mostly focused on the plot or the action sequences. I could tell he was making an effort, and I appreciated it. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were watching as a team again, immersed in the story without distractions. But as the series went on and a particularly flashy character appeared, old habits crept back. "Wow, they really didn't hold back with her, huh?" he said, laughing. "That outfit's barely holding together." I paused the episode, turning to him. "Remember what we talked about?" He looked confused at first, then a little defensive. "What?" That was just one comment. "I know," I said gently. "But it's not just the comment, it's how it makes me feel. I thought we agreed to focus more on the story." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't see why it's such a big deal. I'm trying, okay?" "I know you are," I replied, feeling the tension rise. "But it's not just about the comments. It's about feeling like you hear me, like what I'm saying matters to you." The room fell silent for a moment. I could see he was processing what I'd said, and while I didn't know if it would stick, I hoped he'd start to see the bigger picture. A few days later, we decided to pick up where we'd left off in the series. This time, though, there was a noticeable difference. He didn't say a word about the characters' appearances. It felt almost strange at first, the quietness where I usually expected a comment or a laugh. But as the episode unfolded, I found myself sinking into the story in a way I hadn't in weeks. Without his running commentary, everything seemed more immersive. I could appreciate the details of the plot, the subtle character development, and the tension building between the protagonists. It reminded me of why I fell in love with anime in the first place. When the episode ended, I turned to him, a little nervous. "What did you think?" I asked, unsure of how he'd felt about holding back. He stretched and shrugged lightly. "It was good. A little slower than the last one, but I liked where it's going. Thanks for watching without, I said cautiously, not wanting to break the moment. "It made a difference for me." He smiled faintly. "Yeah, I figured I'd give it a shot. It wasn't so bad, I guess." For the first time in a while, I felt hopeful. This small change had made such a big difference in how I experienced our anime nights. It wasn't perfect, and I knew it wouldn't last forever without continued effort on both sides. But it was a start. Later that night, as I replayed the episode in my mind, I realized just how much I'd missed moments like this. Watching together, enjoying the story for what it was, without any tension or distractions. It felt like we'd taken a step forward, and for the first time in a while, I felt like maybe this was something we could work through together. The next few anime sessions were a mix of progress and familiar habits. For the most part, he kept his comments in check, and I could tell he was making an effort. The quiet moments, where I'd normally brace for a joke or an exaggerated remark, were instead filled with genuine reactions to the story, laughs at a funny scene, gasps during an intense fight, or thoughtful questions about the plot. But every now and then, the old habits crept back in. A new character would appear, and out of instinct, he'd blurt out something like, "Okay, seriously, who designs these outfits?" Or, "That's not even realistic." Sometimes he caught himself, shooting me a sheepish glance as if to say, "Oops, sorry." Other times he didn't seem to notice, and I'd have to decide whether to let it slide or say something. One night, during an episode with a particularly over-the-top character introduction, he let out a loud laugh and said, "All right, they're just trolling us now." I couldn't help but feel the familiar flicker of frustration, but I stopped myself before reacting. Instead, I reminded myself of the effort he'd been making overall. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than before. Later, as we were cleaning up, he turned to me and said, "I know I still slip up sometimes. I'm trying, though." That simple acknowledgement meant more to me than I expected. It wasn't just about the comments anymore. It was about feeling seen and understood. Knowing that he recognized his own habits and was willing to work on them gave me hope that we could find a balance. Progress wasn't linear, and setbacks were inevitable. But the fact that he cared enough to keep trying made me feel like this was something we could tackle together. As our conversations around his comments continued, I began to realize just how much of this issue boiled down to communication. For so long, I'd kept my feelings bottled up, trying to manage my discomfort on my own instead of addressing it head-on. When I finally did bring it up, it wasn't always in the clearest or most constructive way. I'd hinted at my frustration, made indirect comments, or let it spill out during moments of tension. No wonder he'd felt blindsided at first. The more we talked about it, the clearer it became that neither of us had fully understood where the other was coming from. He saw his comments as harmless fun, a natural part of how he watched anime. To him, they weren't criticisms or comparisons. They were observations, nothing more. Meanwhile, I saw them as interruptions that pulled me out of the story and made me feel like our shared experience was being overshadowed by something superficial. Once I started explaining my feelings more directly, without assuming he should automatically understand, things began to shift. He started asking more questions like, "Does it bother you when I joke about the outfits? Or is it just when I talk about their looks? Or, would you rather I just keep all my thoughts to myself while we watch?" Those questions showed me that he wasn't dismissing my feelings. He was trying to understand how to adjust his behavior without losing the parts of himself that made him enjoy anime. I also realized I needed to be more patient. Changing habits isn't easy, and expecting him to completely stop something he'd done for years overnight wasn't fair. Communication wasn't just about expressing what I needed. It was about listening to what he needed too, and finding a middle ground that worked for both of us. The more we talked, the easier it became to navigate this together. As we worked through our conversations, I started to see our differences in a new light. We had completely different ways of engaging with anime, and that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. He approached it with humor and spontaneity, pointing out the absurdities and quirks of the medium that made him laugh. I, on the other hand, loved diving into the emotional depth of the stories, savoring the artistry and character arcs without distractions. Neither of us was wrong, but we needed to figure out how to respect each other's way of enjoying the shows while still sharing the experience. For him, holding back his comments felt like stifling part of what made anime fun. For me, those same comments disrupted the connection I felt to the story. It wasn't about one of us being right or wrong. It was about finding a way to coexist in our shared space. I decided to let go of some of the smaller frustrations. If he made a harmless joke now and then, I wouldn't let it ruin the moment. At the same time, he made a conscious effort to scale back the more exaggerated comments, especially the ones that focused solely on appearance. We didn't have to change who we were, but we both recognized the importance of making room for each other. One night, after we'd finished an episode, he turned to me and said, "Thanks for being patient with me. I know I'm not perfect at this, but I'm trying." I smiled, feeling a sense of relief. I know, and I appreciate it. Respecting our differences didn't mean ignoring them. It meant acknowledging them and choosing to move forward with understanding. That shift made all the difference in how we approached not just anime, but our relationship as a whole. As we settled into this new rhythm, I found myself reflecting on everything we had learned through this process. What started as a minor annoyance about anime comments had revealed something much deeper about our relationship: how we communicated, how we handled differences, and how we supported each other's growth. I realized that my frustration wasn't just about the comments themselves. It was about feeling like my perspective wasn't being acknowledged, like I was carrying the weight of discomfort on my own. Once we opened up the conversation and worked together, I started to feel lighter. He didn't need to be perfect, and neither did I. We just needed to be willing to meet each other halfway. Watching anime together became enjoyable again. The comments didn't disappear entirely, but they came in smaller doses and with more mindfulness. He was careful not to interrupt key moments, and I learned to let go of the occasional joke that didn't land with me. Our differences in how we engaged with anime became less of a conflict, and more of a reminder that we brought unique perspectives to everything we did together. I also learned something important about myself. It was okay to speak up about what I needed, even if it felt uncomfortable. Avoiding the conversation had only made things worse, while being honest, even when it was messy, helped us grow closer. Looking back, I felt proud of how far we'd come. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it didn't need to be. What mattered was that we both tried, that we valued each other enough to work through something that could have easily been ignored. In the end, it wasn't just about anime. It was about learning how to be better partners for each other in the small and the big things. After everything, I kept coming back to the original question: am I the asshole for disliking his comments? At first, I'd worried that I was being too sensitive, making something out of nothing. But now, after working through it with him and reflecting on what we'd learned, I saw things more clearly. Disliking his comments didn't make me an asshole, it made me human. It's natural to have boundaries, even in relationships, and it's okay to feel uncomfortable when those boundaries are crossed, whether intentionally or not. What mattered wasn't the fact that I felt that way. It was how we handled it as a couple. For me, the issue had never been about jealousy or insecurity, and it certainly wasn't about controlling how he expressed himself. It was about wanting to feel like my feelings mattered, that I could voice my concerns without being dismissed. When he finally started to understand that, we found a way to move forward together. For him, it was a lesson in self-awareness and compromise. He learned that even habits that feel harmless can have unintended consequences, and that adjusting those habits doesn't mean losing who you are. By meeting me halfway, he showed that he valued our relationship more than the small, fleeting moments of humor his comments gave him. Ultimately, I don't think there was a clear-cut asshole in this situation. We were just two people navigating a small but significant challenge in our relationship. The experience taught us to listen better, to communicate more openly, and to approach each other's needs with respect and empathy. So, to answer the question, no, I don't think I was the asshole. I think we both grew from this. And in the end, that's what matters most. It wasn't perfect, but it brought us closer, and that's worth everything.